It's lovely to be here, and thank you very much for inviting me. My name's Linda, and I'm from Nordregio, which is the Nordic Centre for Regional Development and Planning, and we're part of the Nordic Council of Ministers family. So we are definitely interested in Finland, but we are always interested in Finland from a Nordic comparative perspective. So for those of you in the audience who are from Finland, I probably won't be able to give you any breaking news about Finland specifically, but what I will try to do instead is to put the situation in Finland into kind of a Nordic context based on some work that we've been doing about the accelerated trend towards remote working, and what that might do from a regional development and planning perspective, and what that might look like into the future. I am in a bit of a different position from David. I really enjoyed that presentation. Thank you very much. It's nice to see something so finished. We're sort of just a bit at the beginning of this project. So in some ways, I might perhaps present you with more questions than answers, but I always think coming up with the right questions is sometimes the most difficult part of the battle. So hopefully it can still be useful. I wasn't really sure where you would all be from, so I'm going to start a little bit with just some very basic Finnish population trends, just to put the rest of the presentation into a bit of a context. And then I'll talk a bit about the implications of the pandemic, and I'll talk about them from 3 different perspectives related to remote work. So changes to mobility, changes to migration, and changes to the nature of multilocality. And then I'll finish with some words about the way that the different institutional contexts within the 5 Nordic countries is kind of shaping a little bit the way that these different changes are kind of playing out in the political space. And just to let you know, I can't actually see you or the chat right now because I'm presenting. So if anyone has questions, or if you see something in the chat that would be useful to pick up straight away, please just speak up. So thinking about Finnish population trends, for those of you who are not from Finland, this is just a very basic measure of population change in the Baltic Sea region since 1990, and going up to 2018. So Finland, the overall population of Finland, like the other Nordic countries, is growing. But what we see, much as David discussed, is that most of this growth has been concentrated in the larger urban areas. So here we see the functional urban areas, and the size of the bubble represents the size of the population, and the colour represents whether it's been growing or what's been happening with the population. And you can see that almost all of the functional urban areas in the Nordic countries have been growing with an annual average of 5% or more since 2010. In contrast, if we look at the entire country, this map I find is a little bit difficult to describe, but I think the basic message is that municipalities that are shaded in brown tones, they're growing. So their decade with the largest population size is in the future, or is predicted to be in the future. And the municipalities shaded in green shades, their decade with the largest population size, it's expected to have been in the past. So you see, even in the context of that growth, we see a lot of green in these maps. And for those of you familiar with Nordic geography, most of those green areas tend to be more rural municipalities. And alongside that, we also see that the Nordic populations are aging. And anyone from the Nordic region, this map won't be a great shock. This shows the old age dependency ratio and how it's changed over time. So now we're in 2008, 2009, 2010, and I think we'll end up in 2018. So you can see here the proportion of the population that is aged over 65 is growing in all of the municipalities across the country mostly, but it's more pronounced in some of the rural areas. And actually, as I was preparing for this presentation, I was thinking of a sort of a kind of simple thought experiment, and this is very rough, so don't quote me on this, but I was interested to think about I think within this context, I'll talk a bit more later on about what we hope for from this trend of increased remote work. And one of the things we talk a lot about in the Nordic context is the potential for this increased mobility brought about by remote work to actually combat some of these negative population trends. So these are just very, very basic scatter plots showing the relationship between net migration and the old age dependency ratio. I only had the figures for 2018 at my fingertips this morning, so it's not exactly precise with the years, but here, oh no, this one is 2021. No, that's good. That's good. So the population, the net migration in 2018 to 2020, compared with the old age dependency ratio, and we see like basically the basic message is that the municipalities that are growing tend to be the ones that have the lowest old age dependency ratio, and I don't see a massive change between these two graphs. But anyway, that was just my small thought experiment this morning while I was having my coffee, so don't put too much weight on that one. I just thought it might be fun to share. So moving on to the pandemic, if we start with the sort of basic narrative of this link between distance work and regional development, we all know during the pandemic, many workplaces were either closed or we were recommended to work from home. And working from a distance more often became more common, and I would say perhaps more comfortable for more workers. So I think in a way what we got was this sort of collective boost to our digital skills. And we know from sort of previous research on digitalisation and the way that the internet and changes in our work lives relate to regional development, that actually the biggest barrier to increased remote work in the past has been the fact that we kind of struggle a bit when it comes to deriving the same value from an online interaction that we can get from a face-to-face interaction. And I don't know that we've come all the way on that, but I think the experience that we had during the pandemic actually really made some inroads in our skills in that area. And so the kind of hypothesis then is that this I guess, weakening of the geographical tie between our work life and our home life was resulting in changed commuting patterns and changed living preferences. And that it's actually these here in the pink that would have implications for planning and regional development in the longer term. And of course, we don't know yet what is very difficult to study a post-pandemic world when the pandemic is sort of ongoing. But we can get some hints. So there's three particular areas that we're interested in. The first is mobility, and we sort of understand mobility as physical movements, usually to pursue shorter term goals, and most often happening on a daily basis. Migration. It's a pretty more simple one, so long-term stable movements involving residential location. And interestingly, I think for us that are often using maps and administrative data to try to understand the world, these movements don't always include movement across an administrative boundary. So particularly when we're looking at the types of movement that we're talking about, so as we discussed already, wanting access to a bigger home or a garden, it might not be necessary to move municipalities in order to do that. And we know that most municipalities include, particularly in the Nordics, include a mix of urban and rural spaces. And then finally, our topic for today, multilocality. So I think this is a very interesting one, and I'm interested if our Finnish audience have different thoughts on how to define this. But our sort of working definition has been the practice of carrying out everyday life in multiple places. So, so we're generally thinking about multilocality in the sense of having access to more than one residence, but perhaps not necessarily ownership of that second residence. So we know now with the sharing economy, there's lots of opportunities to actually have access to a second home without actually necessarily owning it. And particularly during the pandemic, when many locations that would usually rely on international tourism were actually not getting visitors from abroad, and perhaps were able to sort of shift their focus and offer spaces for people who might want to work remotely but don't have a second home of their own. So I'll start with changes to mobility. And as I say, this is fairly preliminary data, but I think it can be kind of interesting. So this is looking at what happened during that brief period, in the Nordics. I don't know if it's exactly the same throughout Europe, but in the Nordic countries, most of the restrictions and recommendations relating to COVID, we had sort of a bit of a reprieve between September last year and then late November, when the Omicron surge sort of came. So if we look at Google mobility data from that time, so this was the 11th of November, which I think was either a Tuesday or a Thursday. So it was a fairly typical day. There was no red day, no particular reason why people wouldn't go to work. We can see that if we compare that to our pre-pandemic baseline, which is the average of all work travels in January and February 2020, we still see a quite marked decline in work-related travel. So on average, 20% less travels to work compared to our pre-pandemic baseline. And you can see the capital regions here. I can point on this scale. Sorry, I'm pointing on my little screen. Around the capital regions, apart from Helsinki, actually, maybe it's interesting. We see a more marked decline in travels to work. So even after we didn't have so much of a public health reason to avoid going to work, we still went less, I would say, is the main takeaway from this map. Migration, I think, is also interesting. So the number of people that actually moved during the pandemic. And you'll notice here I'm really highlighting the fact that they may not make the move across administrative boundaries. And then I'm about to show you a map that's based on administrative boundaries. But I think this highlights a little bit, coming back to Mika's point, that actually there's only so much we can do with the data, that there's only so much of a story that we can manage to actually tell with the data that we have access to. But nevertheless, we do see this is average internal net migration in 2020 on this map. So this is people who made a move across an administrative boundary within the same country in 2020. And we do see on this map signs of new internal migration patterns. So all the Nordic capitals had net out migration, and the in migration was in regions close to the big cities in all the Nordic countries. So the highest in migration was municipalities on the outskirts of the labour market areas. So outside of the capital cities, but still within commuting distance of them. And another sort of winner, I guess you can say, was popular tourist destinations. So places that were perhaps you could call attractive rural areas. And to put that into a context, I can put alongside here, this is the same, exactly the same indicator, same legend, but showing the average between 2010 and 2018. And you can see, I believe, a more diverse picture in 2020. So something is definitely happening with respect to migration. And I believe that this is quite consistent with the data from similar research that focuses only on Finland. But I think Mika will enlighten you more on that after the break. Another migration pattern, and I apologise, we only had this data at this point for Sweden, but if you have it in Finland, I would love to also have it. But this is the number of summer houses that actually the change in the number of summer houses, and the blue colour shows you where the number of summer houses has actually decreased. So the map on the left is the average annual change between 2016 and 2019. And you see that the numbers are fairly stable there. If anything, they're increasing the number of summer houses. But then if you look at the change between 2019 and 2020, you can see that actually, particularly around the south of Sweden, there was quite a large decrease in the number of summer houses in many of those municipalities. And actually, if you look at the reasons why a summer house would cease to exist anymore, one is if it would be demolished, but another reason could explain that is that if a person becomes permanently registered in that location, it no longer counts as a second home. So someone changes it to their address. And if we look at the actual, so if we bring in some qualitative data and some local knowledge and look at the areas where the decreases were the highest, this is consistent sort of with our migration map and with the data about which areas have been attractive for people to move. So these would be considered quite attractive areas within Sweden for people to make a permanent move. And then I think the big question is this just a factor of the pandemic or is it a lasting trend? And I think one thing to keep in mind why the Swedish case is maybe quite useful here is that actually there wasn't so strong restrictions on movement in Sweden. So, for example, in Norway, there was a ban on summer house use because they didn't want people, one, moving around too much, or two, spending time in a region that might not have the healthcare capacity to treat everybody. So there could be a motivation to change your registered address to the summer house location just for the pandemic. I think that motivation didn't exist in Sweden because we were free to use our summer houses if we wanted to. Then finally, multilocality. So this practice of carrying out everyday life in multiple places. And actually, as we've already sort of spoken about a little bit, there's a long tradition of multilocality in Finland, but also in other Nordic countries. So estimates sort of say approximately half of the population in Sweden, Finland, Iceland and Norway have access to second homes either by owning them themselves or by a close family member owning one. And usually a second home is understood as a detached house in a rural area where no one is permanently registered. And here you can see the majority, so this is sort of looking at where are the summer houses, and the majority of permanent homes in the Nordics tend to be in either predominantly urban regions or in intermediate regions close to a city, where the majority of summer houses tend to be in rural regions. So you sort of have, in a way, this kind of continuous stream of people from urban to rural municipalities is a kind of invisible counter-urbanisation process. And I think the reason why we say that it's invisible is because there's not really much data that can tell us about how much time someone is spending in one or other place. So in all the Nordic countries, you have one registered address, and usually that's your primary place of residence, and usually that's your permanent home, which tends to be in an urban area. One thing we do know data-wise is where the second homes are. So you can see here the size of the dots is the indicating the number, and then the colour is showing you the number of second homes per 1,000 inhabitants. So you can see actually in all the Nordic countries there are many second homes, but actually in Finland there is really a lot here in the south of Finland. So yeah, throughout all the Nordic countries you see this. In Iceland that we see is less common than the other Nordic countries. And then I have just a couple of minutes left, so I just want to say some words actually about the kind of policy side, because one thing that we have noticed in our research so far is that even within the Nordic region, where we have quite common history and we share a lot of things, we actually see like quite different stories emerging around multilocality and migration, mobility, as we sort of think about moving to a period we might call post-pandemic. And I think it's a lot to do with the different starting points in the countries. So Iceland, I'll say some words about the jobs without placement in a moment. Finland, multilocality, as we all know, is very high on the political agenda. In these two countries, these issues were on the agenda prior to the pandemic. So here I think we see a more proactive policy approach. Norway, Sweden and Denmark In contrast, I think we see a more reactive approach, but in different ways. So in Norway, we have a long history of what we call delocalization policy. So we have a long history, both because of the I guess the economic structure of the country that's very much based on natural resources, but also because of a conscious policy approach to trying to actually avoid large concentrations of people only in urban areas and to keep the rural areas strong. So I think this trend towards remote work, it perhaps fits with this policy framework, but it's not so explicit as we see in perhaps Finland and Iceland. In Sweden, again, the potential is evident, but the implications for regional policy are not so clear yet. And in Denmark, the conversation is much more focused on the mobility aspect, so how increased remote work can reduce the congestion in bigger cities. I just want to say a quick couple extra words about the Icelandic case, because I think it's quite interesting for the Finnish colleagues. So in Iceland, they implemented a policy that was signed back in 2018 that 10% of all state jobs should be advertised without placement by 2024. And actually at the time, I was in a rural area in Iceland just before the pandemic, and they actually thought this policy was quite funny. They didn't actually see that Reykjavik had her exact words were, "We here in the rural areas are very good at using technology to do our jobs, but the second that Reykjavik wants to know what we think, they put us on a plane." But actually, since the pandemic, this policy has gained a lot of traction, and it looks like it might actually succeed. And the basis of this policy is that all people have a right to these jobs regardless of where they live. So it's not necessarily about moving the people to the countryside. It's about making sure that the people who are already in the countryside have access to the jobs. And one thing that I think is very interesting about this policy is that it never imagined working from home, but rather from workstations around the country. So here you can see a map of, it's in Icelandic, but if I, for example, live over here in the eastern part of the country and I want to apply for a job that's in the capital region, I can actually go on this map and see, like, where could my office be? Where could my desk be? So all of these dots represent somewhere that I could use as my office if I was to actually be a successful candidate in one of these jobs. And a really interesting thing, actually, recently, it hasn't been signed yet, but when the policy first started, the idea was that people should, all the managers should look through their portfolio of jobs and see, like, which ones could be possible to work remotely. And actually now there is a discussion about reversing that burden of truth, and actually that managers would actually need to make a case for why a job needs to be in place. So actually, rather than justifying why this one can be worked remotely, they would need to justify why this one has to be based in Reykjavik. I think that's quite interesting. So just to sort of sum up a little bit, I think that this new trend, or it's not a new trend, I would say accelerated trend towards increased remote work does offer a genuine opportunity for more balanced regional development, but the effects are unlikely to be evenly distributed, and they won't happen by accident. So we need to think about the types of policies and that will enable or inhibit the types of futures that we might be interested in. And yeah, this framework, I think, of thinking about mobility, migration, and multilocality as 3 dimensions is quite useful. But I would argue that we probably need more nuanced quantitative data. So I think perhaps more data at grid level, where we can analyse the population trends within municipalities, not just between them. But also I think qualitative data is really key, because these phenomena that are going on are quite complex, and quantitative data it looks great. You can make really nice maps and it feels convincing, but it lies to us all the time. So it's really important that we can combine different types of data sources to try to understand what's going on. And before I sign out, I just want to also invite you, if you find this stuff interesting, we will actually launch in Helsinki state of the Nordic region. Actually, we will launch it in all the Nordic capitals. There will be one event in each Nordic capital, and we will also be online. And there are so many maps that I would have loved to include in this presentation, but I couldn't do it because they're under wraps until next Wednesday. So very welcome. The link is here. I would love to see you all, and here's some references and links, and thank you very much for listening.